Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the panel on digital operational resilience. My name is Linda Strazdinja. I'm the head of technology practice at A4 Consulting, and it is my pleasure to be here and to moderate this session. As the name already suggests, we will be discussing the digital operational resilience of the financial services sector. How do we strengthen it? And for that, of course, we will discuss the European Commission's DORA proposal. As we know, the DORA proposal aims to streamline the existing rules, fill in any gaps in the ICT risk management framework of the financial sector. And so in this session, we will discuss the design of the framework, is it future-proof? And of course, we will touch upon the proposed new oversight regime for third-party ICT providers. So with me here today, I have the pleasure of welcoming a great group of panelists, and I think we're going to have a great discussion. I would like to welcome Tomáš Neděle from the Czech Ministry of Finance, Claudia Goeliano from the European Securities and Markets Authority, ESMA, William Hoffman, who is the Deutsche Bank's Regional Chief Information Security Officer, Stella Nunn, Director for Operational Resilience and IT Risk at PwC, and Jan Eger, a member of the Government Relations and Regulatory Strategy team at the London Stock Exchange Group. So welcome all, and thank you for being here with us today. And maybe to kickstart the discussion, I'll turn to you, Claudia, to set the scene. Could you tell us a bit as to why do you think it's important to look at digital operational resilience in the financial services sector now? What has ESMA already done, and how is it feeding into this work? So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you very much for the invitation to this panel on this very important topic. As you said, I think really that the DORA proposal is very important and is part of a wider work that has been done at EU level, but also at international level, to try to strengthen the operational resilience of the financial sector. In particular, at ESMA, we have been working on this topic for a while, and together with the other two ESAs, have published a joint technical advice in 2019 on legislative improvement that were needed in this context. Let me start the fact that we published it together with the other two ESAs because I think it's important to reflect on the fact that this topic, many aspects of ICT risk, of digital operational resilience, are really cross-sectoral in the financial market. So it's very good that we had this technical advice that was joint. And at the time, we published this advice in response to the European Commission FinTech Action Plan. And as we noted at the time, but it's even clearer today, ICT risk, including cybersecurity risk, may represent a threat to the stability of the financial system, but also may undermine, what is very relevant, the confidence of in the financial market. And cyber concerns are digital operational resilience concerns are a growing concerns because cyber attacks have increased and the potential impact is even greater. And the last year, the situation that we are all living with the COVID crisis has highlighted further the high relevance of ensuring the digital operational resilience. In a context where a large part of the financial sector has been teleworking and digitalization has really increased exponentially. And there has been recently a publication of the VIS, very interesting, the VIS report that has really highlighted the increasing digitalization of financial services in the last year, and also they also observed the number of increasing cyber attacks, in particular in the financial sector. So what we think is very good, what we had advised 2 years ago, and what we think is very good in DORA is the fact that we need more harmonization of requirements around digital operational resilience in the financial markets. because the idea is always the same in this topic, that is same activity, same risk, and same regulation. So what we advised at the time, and it's true again today, is that every relevant, yes, I try to keep the microphone closer, every relevant entity should effectively and in an harmonized way manage ICT risk, including cybersecurity risk, with an appropriate governance, operational, and control measure in place. And strictly related to that is the reporting issues. When we looked at the reporting requirement in the sectoral legislation, we found a wide variety of requirements, but not only refer to the reporting, but also to the terminology that had been used, that was associated with this reporting. And so we think that really the harmonization also of the terminology that is used in this context is very important. And maybe I stop here and then we can start the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Claudia, for giving this great overview. Maybe then I'll turn to you, Tomasz. Of course, in the Council, you've now started discussing the DORA proposal. So maybe you could give us a bit of a flavor as to where the discussions are and how do you see the DORA proposal from the Czech point of view?
Good morning to everyone. I hope you can hear me well. So, as you have mentioned, I represent the Czech Republic in the Council EU during the DORA negotiations. So I have to say that definitely we consider the cybersecurity as crucial for financial market, but we still think that there should be some changes done in the current proposal so that, for example, the interplay with other pieces of European legislation is, let's say, performed well. So the discussion is currently focusing, for example, on the interplay between NIS2 directive, the proposal of the new directive, and the DORA. So we would like to, for example, be quite sure that the national CISO teams under NIS2 can still operate, can still provide its guidance, its, let's say, help in the case of some cybersecurity incidents. That's, let's say, one issue. Then we would like to avoid some kind of, let's say, double reporting when it comes to Payment Services Directive and the DORA regulation. So again, we think that it should be done, the interplay, so that there's only one reporting under DORA, so that financial institutions are, let's say, not too much overloaded by different kinds of requirements to report some incidents. And I have to mention one issue which is quite important for the Czech Republic, and it is the question of proportionality. Because, for example, what we have seen in the past is that unfortunately some new legislation is driving out of the market some enterprises like SMEs, micro enterprises, and we would not like to see it even in the case of DORA regulation. Because, for example, the ICT management framework, it is already implemented in, let's say, entities of a bigger size, but when it comes to some innovative fintech companies, we think that what is crucial is the, let's say, real state of their cybersecurity, and not so much focusing on the internal rules and, let's say, internal, yeah, that's it. To focus on the reality, not to focus so much on the rules that should be described and then submitted to the competent authorities. So, to mention some of the topics that we are discussing during the Council negotiations.
Thank you, Tomasz. I think you already raised a couple of the topics that we want to cover in this session. So then I'll turn now to our industry speakers, and I'll start off with exactly the question you finished on, the proportionality of the framework. So, as you rightly said, DORA proposes a horizontal framework that covers, a wide variety of financial entities. So, of course, the question arises: is it proportional for them all? So Stella, maybe I turn to you first. What are your impressions? So why do we need such a framework, and are the risks properly captured? Is the framework kind of future-proof also in terms of the cyber threat landscape, and is it proportional? So over to you, Stella.
Thank you. That was a lot of questions actually in one thing. So let me just maybe pick a couple of them rather than try and cover all of them, because I know the other panelists will have views as well on some of those. So if I just pick up on the proportionality piece in the first instance, as Thomas said, it's incredibly important, the proportionality, and I work with financial service clients every day, either from a technology risk perspective or an operational resilience, as opposed to even digital operational resilience, but working with clients in the UK, working on meeting the new regulations or imminent regulations around operational resilience, which is from a business-driven end. So I see sort of both sides as well of that. And we've had the same discussions in the UK around proportionality of those regulations as well. And how does that actually translate practically for firms? And it is incredibly important. There are lots of different frameworks, guidelines, policies now that impact the same parts of the operation. So technology and operations are impacted by the same thing. So proportionality across the board on these horizontal frameworks, as well as the policies that come from your local regulation, there has to be the interlinks. Firms have to understand how they're going to respond, and like DORA, in terms of there's an element of how prescriptive will it be, and I think that may also play into the proportionality piece. Where things are principle based, you can apply them perhaps in a more easily proportionate way, and where things become more prescriptive, is that going to force firms to answer things and do things in a way that feels less proportionate potentially? And I'd be interested from the other panelists on their views as well, because that feels like a key element for me in terms of that proportionality element. There were lots of questions in there. So in terms of maybe just, again, sort of, we've already spoken about the interlinks and we've got EBA outsourcing guidelines, we've got the cloud guidelines and the ESMA guidelines and DORA. And in the UK, we have two imminent regulations, one operational resilience and one also outsourcing and third party. Again, there are benefits of each, but I also really picked up on Thomas's thing around the reporting as well, in terms of whether it be, on the Payment Service Directive, but there's going to be lots of different types of reporting, again, that will impact the same parts of my clients and the financial service firms. How do we ensure that we don't force people to spend their entire time reporting on things and actually focus on the real value of these frameworks, which, you can draw out elements of DORA around some of the testing, as well as the third party oversight. There's some real benefit to be gained, as long as it doesn't become too cumbersome. So that would just another thing that I might draw out. But yeah, and I'm sure we'll come around on some of the other questions as well.
Yes, thank you, Stella. Maybe William, then I pass over to you to kind of respond to this. I'm sure you also have thoughts on whether the framework is proportionate. Is it going to introduce maybe a lot of new processes compared to what is already in place in the industry?
Yeah, excellent. Good morning. Thanks very much. So I was pleased to hear in both Claudia's, Thomas's, and Stella's points, certain aspects which really resonate are important for us. This idea of harmonization, this idea of recognizing that there are multiple different types of reporting that are relevant when we think about resilience. Obviously, the points around proportionality and recognizing that when we talk about operational resilience, obviously cyber is an important part of that. And as a cyber practitioner, it's quite close to the things that I worry about. But of course, it's also a broader topic, and it brings together a very complex ecosystem that includes operational processes, and of course, the partners that we work with from an outsourcing perspective, third-party providers as well. So I think, clearly the direction of travel of what we're seeing in the regulation resonates with us as an organization and with us as a sector, right? I think ensuring that we have the ability to anticipate and respond to threats, whether they're cyber threats or other aspects of threats, is an important part of how we manage risk and how we manage our businesses. And I think we need to think about this in terms of what we do within our own organizations, but also the ICT partners that we work with from outside, right? Anything that we do from a regulatory perspective needs to make sure that not only does it support innovation, but also allows us to benefit from innovation and finding kind of that right balance between the partnership between banks and the providers that we have. It's really important for us to make sure that the evolution of the approach to regulation as it relates to operational resilience is very focused on risk. We're keen to see a strong risk-based approach. We want to recognize the unique threat landscape and it's important that we think about the threat landscape and proportionality when it comes to a risk-based approach. I think there's a couple of aspects as well. And interesting to hear Thomas's points about proportionality, right? We want to make sure that anything that we do, is implementable and manageable from an overall perspective as we think about our outsourcing strategy. The work that we do with cloud service providers is a perfect example, right? We know that cloud providers provide a unique opportunity to help promote and improve the resilience of the sector. We recognize that there are new risks associated with cloud outsourcing, but of course there are very, very strong opportunities and benefits from a resilience perspective as well. So I think as we think about the evolution of DORA and other operational resilience frameworks, it's important that we balance out the benefits that come with these relationships in addition to some of the challenges and risks that are associated with them.
Thank you, William. We had a question from Miguel Carapeto. Can any of the panelists specify perhaps some instances where DORA is overly prescriptive or disproportionate? So maybe I turn back to you, William or Stella, if you have some examples.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of areas that we are particularly interested in from a prescriptive perspective. So one of them, for instance, is around contract termination. Right, the idea that there is a potential requirement around contract termination creates some challenges. A, in terms of the ability to very quickly shift into a new service model. B, the potential impact that has on the willingness of providers to operate in a region or in an environment where there may be very, very strict or unforeseen contract termination requirements, for instance. I think another example would be around where there are proposals around mandatory multi-vendor strategies, right? Any good approach around working with multiple vendors should be based on the specific risk determinations of the organization, looking at the size of a vendor contract, looking at the importance of it, thinking about how it supports things like co-innovation and some of the partnerships that the industry is thinking about as well. So those are two examples: contract termination and the multi-vendor strategy, which can be over-prescriptive.
And Stella?
I think they're excellent examples, actually. And if I just take a slightly different tack, because rather than repeat what William said, which I think are spot on, the understanding of the ICT providers, and as you say, those that may then choose not to enter this market or leave this market. We have seen examples some while ago even, but in the UK with when they issued the first discussion paper for operational resilience in 2018, which laid out again sort of how this would lay out and how therefore, it was intimated more of how providers would need to support that regulation, but they felt like a slightly indirect regulation for some. And we did see one particular ICT provider exit the market when they understood actually what it would mean to support that, and decided not to pursue the platform that they had built. So there are implications, and that was for firms that are smaller and perhaps don't have some of the procurement power of the larger firms. So there are implications, and I think William actually was spot on drawing out some of those.
Yeah, thank you, Stella. Maybe then I'll turn over to you, Jan. How do you see the framework? Give us kind of a first sense, and what are some of the main things that have caught your attention?
Great. Well, thank you for giving me the opportunity and also speaking on the panel. And also, really, I do want to thank the European Commission because DORA, I think, is very timely. And it's, the Commission has been very open also in its engagement here, which I think is very important. We clearly, give the utmost importance to cybersecurity and risk management, and very supportive of the efforts by not only the EU, but governments around the world, really, to enhance the resilience of the financial services industry. So, in fact, my colleague, Ollie Bage, founded and co-chaired the Cloud Data Management Capability Working Group, which is really a group of banks, technology companies, cloud providers, that's working to define best practices on how financial institutions move their data to the cloud, keep it safe from hackers, and so on. And as been mentioned, it is a critical time with COVID, of course, and the challenge of operational disruptions. And I have to say, to credit to the financial services industry, which has fared remarkably well in this environment here. And hopefully, really, DORA will strengthen that backbone of the industry and really bolster the European single market as a secure and open, innovative hub. So, I mean, 3 points I really want to underscore that DORA, I think, should fulfill in order to deliver on its purpose and promises. And that's, the first is international openness, really. A principle, I have to say, we were very encouraged to see the Commission reiterate in its recent paper on economic and financial system, fostering openness, strength, and resilience. And very clearly, it's important that European regulators are able to oversee firms providing services into the single market. But at the same time, this requirement should also be balanced with ensuring that the EU does not inadvertently set an international precedent for onshoring in the digital space, or include provisions within DORA which in practice could lead to data localization. And just to say again that data localization causes immense challenges to the industry, the ability to innovate, to manage risk, ultimately tackle societal problems like financial crime and climate change. We know this is not an aim of DORA, but the risk should nonetheless be front of mind, especially as discussions continue, and it should not slip through the back door, so to speak, and undermine the really strategic objectives that the EU is pursuing. And the other is proportionality, which has been mentioned, very supportive really of everything that's been said here. And I think that the final point I would stress would be transparency. And I think that's particularly of importance when it really comes to the criteria for designating the critical ICT third-party service providers, which is a very new concept in European regulation. I think it's a bolt-on in many ways that distinguishes DORA from other digital operational resilience rules and regulations internationally. And it's really in this unique area of the legislation that where transparency will from the outset help to provide certainty around the notion of criticality. And it is something that needs to also be taken into account in a harmonized manner, in what has already been agreed in, say, MiFID, EMIR, and the benchmark regulation, to enhance the stability and the resilience, and help the firms that may be deemed critical really plan for the future and implement it very smoothly. So I'll leave it there, and looking forward to other questions.
Thank you, Jan. I think we'll get back to some of your points later in discussion, especially around the oversight of third-party ICT providers. Now, I'd like to turn back to our public sector speakers, maybe turning to you, Tomasz. You've heard the concerns from the industry around proportionality. We also have a question in the chat about how because DORA applies to such a wide range of financial sector entities, including auditors, you know, how would these requirements be applied to these different business models? And then maybe I would also like you to, you already mentioned a bit the interplay with other legislations that you see that there might be some overlaps. So maybe I could pass over to you to react on these.
Okay, thank you. Regarding auditors, I have to say that it's, let's say, one of the kind of entities that we would like to even exclude, let's say, totally from the DORA proposal, as we don't see this kind of business as really, let's say, financial service that should be covered by the DORA and which should be supervised by the financial, let's say, competent authority. So my response to that is that we want to exclude auditors at all from the DORA scope. Regarding the proportionality, I've mentioned it. Let's say the other speakers as well. Maybe to have some ideas how the proportionality should or could be, let's say, enhanced in the proposal. We think that there are some exclusions for, let's say, micro enterprises or in the size of equaling to micro enterprises, but we think that this should be as well focused on small entities as well, so that they have some, let's say, lighter regime. The other aspect is that we have some entities that are providing different kind of services, such as transportation in the Czech Republic, and these entities are as well providing, for example, some innovative payment solutions for a variety of customers. And again, it doesn't make much sense to cover these entities by the DORA, because let's say the size of business that are providing in the field of finance is so small that it will be too burdensome for them, and they will probably leave the market. As again, we have seen, for example, in the PSD2, when we have, for example, some telco companies providing very small proportion of their business in a, again, payment sector. And because of the, let's say, too much burdensome regulation, they simply decided not to continue to invest in, for example, strong customer authentication, and they have decided to leave the market. So that's what I am a bit afraid of. That should not be the, let's say, the result of the DORA. Yeah. So.
Thank you, Thomas. And Claudia, maybe I ask you also you to react to some of the comments that the industry has made. And
thank you, thanks for all the comments. I think the proportionality issue is a relevant one. At the same time, I think that part of it will be addressed in the level 2, because there are several things that are left to the level 2 regulation. And probably now I'm speaking, using my opinion, probably it's also difficult to take it into fully into account in the level 1, because the Commission wants this regulation to last, to be in a way future-proof. So maybe many things will be addressed later. The scope is really broad, it's true. But what I think is one of the main objectives of DORA is really trying to avoid what has happened until now, so the proliferation of national regulatory initiatives, and a bit what I was saying earlier, that there was quite a heterogeneity of requirements, terminology for different entities that are in the same market at the end. So maybe of course, there are things that can be adjusted, and will be probably adjusted before the final publication. But I think that is also referred to something that has been mentioned earlier with reference, for instance, to reporting. At the moment, there are a lot of different regimes for reporting, and here we are trying in a way to streamline the reporting, so to avoid really the duplication of different systems. So I think the objective is very clear. At the same time, we see that since the proposal wants to capture the full financial market, it's not easy. And many of the comments that we are discussing now, we can see them in the proposal. In terms of overlaps with existing legislation, I think that we're all looking into it, including the Commission, the co-legislators, and the ESA. We mentioned the guidelines. We published our guidelines on outsourcing to cloud service providers in December, where the DORA proposal was already out. And these guidelines, what was the main objective of our guidelines was to be as consistent as possible with the already published guidelines by EBA and the EIOPA. Why we did that? Because we think that, again, that the consistency in the financial markets is very important. But of course, I think that a full analysis, a systematic assessment of all the existing overlap, we needed to do it very, very carefully. Thank you, Claudia.
So we talked now about the consistency with the EU, different EU regimes. I would now like to go a bit more international. So, of course, Jan already mentioned international openness. Stella also mentioned that there are other there's work ongoing internationally on operational resilience, some of which is more principle-based than we see DORA is. So, Stella, I'll turn to you maybe first. So how does DORA fit into this? Do you think there's a danger arising from these different frameworks especially for international financial institutions that you work with?
Maybe not danger, but there is, there's we spend a lot of time with clients talking about how do they tackle the different requirements, and sometimes the requirements aren't vastly different, but there are nuances that mean that it can't necessarily be done in one way. And in some ways that's more frustrating sometimes. It's not a clear difference that you can actually sort of find out. It's almost too similar but not the same in really simple terms, and that does stretch right across the globe. So not just through the European guidelines and regulation and what's happening in the UK, but also in the US as well as some of the recent MAS publications and so you're starting to see an element of convergence around this topic of operational resilience, but it won't come directly in line. And I think that's something. So working with firms over the last few years, there has been a sense of sort of waiting for this convergence and hoping that it will line up. And therefore, there's been a little bit of hesitance in actually dealing with some of these in a timely fashion. And actually, we've reached the point, having spoken with a lot of the different regulators, and that we sort of encourage firms now not to wait for that convergence. That you must get moving, whichever jurisdiction is leading, and where be sensible and look at it, and work out if you're going to start in one jurisdiction and then move that across a group, certainly for a large international group. But no longer wait for that convergence. It's not going to happen perfectly and beautifully come together. So work out, that actually what you do for one in the main will answer the others. But as I say, those nuances will just need to be factored in of, again, we come back to some of the reporting piece and things, how you would then respond, to the different guidelines or jurisdictions and regulations. There will be that, and it's never going to be perfect. But there are things you can maximise by starting on one. I mean, one of the elements, and you just spoke about outcomes and different pieces and prescriptive against sort of principles based. Again, that's something that firms are having to factor in. Very much still, I would encourage people to focus on the outcomes, whether it's a prescriptive guideline, not what we're trying to achieve as an industry as certain outcomes. And I think if those outcomes are common, that is the useful thing to focus on as well. And just one other quick point, as the other panelists were speaking and we were talking about some of the DORA pieces, the difference again between some of these guidelines in terms of entity level, sort of focus on DORA being an entity level, perhaps focus more at the moment in the level 1 guidelines, where actually many international firms work on a group basis and have group frameworks that they leverage, and for the right reasons, so of course economies of scale and etc. But so again, that feels slightly at odds with this, and again, so the different guidelines pitched at different levels. So that would just be, as I say, there's a lot out there, but look for what's common as opposed to look for what's different, I guess.
It's very interesting. William, I'll turn to you. You're working for an international financial institution, so how do you see these different frameworks interacting? Are they overlapping? Is everything clear?
I think Stella's point about the risk of similar but different regulatory expectations is, is a real challenge for us. If we think about ultimately the objective of DORA and other operational resilience regulation is how do we protect the financial sector? How do we protect the ecosystem? How do we protect our clients? And we operate a robust global operating model, right? If you think about things like the way we monitor and manage for incidents, we have a 24/7 follow the sun model, which means that we leverage a team in Singapore during part of that 24-hour cycle, a team in Frankfurt for the middle, a team in Jacksonville, Florida for for later in the European day. And that means that we can very seamlessly move work from one jurisdiction to another. We can monitor what's happening overnight in Asia or Europe from the US and so on. So as we think about the implementation of regulation like this, we need to make sure that we don't inadvertently break our ability to operate on a global basis like that. If I think about it from a cyber perspective, there's a real challenge in terms of just not enough cyber professionals around the world to support all of the work that we need to do. So operating on a global basis allows us to leverage the best expertise in whatever region they happen to sit in to protect the organization and the sector on a global basis. So, Jan talked a little bit about the challenge of localization and, the potential treatment of non-local third-party providers. Obviously, the avoiding restricting non-European third-party providers or any sort of non-local third-party providers helps to support that global operating model. One of the other things that the industry is doing that will really help address, some of the similar but different challenges when we see with regulation is collaborating on something called the Financial Sector Cybersecurity Profile. And this is in partnership with the Cyber Risk Institute. And what the profile is designed to do is look at the broad expectations from a regulatory perspective for cyber compliance, associate that with some of the best practice frameworks, whether it's the NIST framework or the ISO framework, and provide a tool that can be used from everyone from startup fintechs to global banks to even cloud service providers, and provide a very consistent mechanism for organizations to review and demonstrate their compliance with really important cybersecurity regulations. And I think if we can continue as a community, not just the financial institutions, but also with our partners, with the regulatory community, to promote and implement the cyber profile, that will, I think, allow us to achieve this broad operational resilience in a way that is achievable and most efficient for the entire industry.
Thank you, William. I would like to now turn into going over towards our last part of discussion. I would like to now turn to this new critical ICT third-party provider oversight regime that DORA introduces. Arguably also one of the most discussed parts of the proposal. Jan, I would like to start with you. So DORA is setting really a new EU and arguably maybe also a global precedent into bringing technology providers into direct oversight of financial supervisory authorities. So what are you hearing and seeing on the market?
Well, I think that's right. I think it really sets a new precedent. I think it is a paradigm shift. I just want to reiterate also, I think that, any potential stakeholders that could be captured as CTPPs or critical ICT third-party service providers by DORA, they need absolute clarity on whether they are in or out of scope. I think there are some good reasons why, but I mean, the proposed text so far does allow the Oversight Forum to make those determinations based on a very broad set of criteria. So I think, really to keep the regulation proportionate, to maintain the EU's attractiveness as a place to do business, and in particular also avoid setting an international precedent for onshoring. I would suggest that what constitutes a presence in the union, to take a phrase, really is approached in a very technical manner, both in a way that makes business sense and doesn't hurt the overall resilience objectives here. So I think in that sense, I would really support the aligning DORA also with what had been previously agreed in GDPR, where it allows, for example, non-EU firms to appoint a representative and still serve the European market. If the concern of the policymakers is the ability to enforce, then we would expect that the presence of a representative just under GDPR should really suffice there. And to come back to that data localization point I made earlier, I know it is not an explicit intention of DORA, and there's a recital that essentially speaks out against data localization. But I think the concern really is that this could slip in or inadvertently be effective. So one example here is, for example, the on-site inspections on the full range of relevant operations. So following those principles of rejecting data localization, really on-site inspections should only apply where there are existing data centers within the jurisdictions, because otherwise you are forcing the relocation of IT infrastructure of those critical third-party service providers into the EU, and you're negating the principle that the draft legislation at the moment, at least in the discussion, includes against data localization. And just to say again, it does cause immense harm, but also there is that real problem that there are a number of jurisdictions around the world who have data localization as an objective aim. And the European Commission, the EU member states have in the past very vocally spoken out against those practices in the defense of European business, in the defense of doing business across borders. It really would be a shame if DORA were to give cause and justification to the aims in other jurisdictions really here.
Maybe as a follow-up to you, Jan, do you think that DORA appropriately captures the risks of ICT third-party providers? And you mentioned the scope. Do you find it's appropriate and sufficiently clear as it's drafted now? I have a feeling that no, but maybe I'll allow you to expand on that.
Well, I think it appears to potentially capture really a wide array of firms, not just perhaps in a very traditional sense that potentially the audience or the panelists may consider, but really due to the focus of the customers you serve and just providing data, one could be in scope of being a critical third-party provider. So, give you an example here, really close to home. Technology providers such as data vendors, they deliver information to their customers to make better decisions, whether that is ESG scoring, for example, or anti-money laundering information, or market data. Either way, I think very different business models from perhaps some of the other firms considered, and I think proportionality should be considered here. And really, looking at what the Basel Committee has come out with, I think the term critical operations or workload, that should be a guiding principle here also in making those determinations, rather than say at entity level, but actually at what type of service are you providing. Really, to quote, I think what Mr. Hakkarainen said earlier, I thought makes a lot of sense here. Same activity, same risk, same rules, same supervision. And I think that should apply in DORA as well. And so far I see very different types of activities, potentially very different types of risks here, but applying the same set of rules potentially under the same type of supervision. You're having more clarity around that and working that out, I think, in detail. That's going to be key also to giving investor confidence.
Thank you, Ian. William, maybe I go back to you. You mentioned that you're working, of course, with third-party ICT providers. So do you believe that the DORA proposal appropriately captures the risks? And what do you think of this oversight regime?
So look, I think there is, if correctly calibrated, this idea of some degree of oversight of third-party providers can in fact be useful and can help, understand where there's risks around concentration and so on. But I think what we want to avoid is to make sure that we're not creating multiple layers of testing of the same services, right? So as part of our general third-party risk management processes, whether required by regulation or not, of course, we need to understand, the way that our third parties are managing risks that could have a downstream impact on us. As you know, as an industry, we've been really focused, particularly over some incidents in the past month, on the risks associated with kind of the supply chains that supply not just financial institutions, but the broader industry and even the public sector as well. So I think if there is an opportunity for financial institutions to be able to use and benefit from some of these oversight activities, that potentially creates, a positive outcome, both for us as a financial services institution, for potentially the critical third-party providers as well, so that they're not having to provide, in many cases, the same information, the same risk management information to every single institution that they work with. So that has, the benefit of reducing the cost on their side, reducing the cost on our side, and potentially, improving, the overall resilience of the sector. But I think we also need to be very careful in terms of, is the capability, or does the capability and capacity exist for that direct supervision and oversight, to be executed by, by the supervisory authorities. I saw that there was a question in the chat about the capability of the authorities to do so. I've already talked about the challenge of, cyber expertise and cyber talent. So we need to make sure that if this does become, part of the oversight and supervisory responsibility, that the agencies are staffed up and have the capability and the skills in order to be able to do that. So I think the other thing that we need to be very careful of is that we don't inadvertently reduce the incentive for innovation across the sector and particularly across the EU as well, right? I think there needs to be recognition that innovation needs to be fostered, and it's one of the areas that, and this has come up a couple times in the conversation as well. We don't create an overly complex regulatory and supervisory requirement that forces out small players, because of the cost of compliance associated with them. So I think there is an opportunity here, but it needs to be very carefully calibrated, and it needs to be done in such a way that we're not duplicating work either with the critical third-party providers or between the firms that are using them as well.
Thank you, William. And Stella, if I may pass to you, do you think that this new oversight framework is a template on how to address outsourcing and new technologies in Europe going forward?
Yes, possibly. I think in terms of probably, if I talk a little bit about the conversations that I have off the back of what William has just said, as well around the benefit that this could have also for the industry as it is now, not just the new entrants and things, it does feel that this could really benefit. And if, again, take a selfish view from a UK perspective of the type of conversations and the type of debate that's been happening around not just ICT third party, but all types of third party supply chain, with the view that the new regulation will force firms to really truly engage with their third parties and understand how their services are delivered in much more detail than they currently do, and really have to rethink how they even contract potentially. What that's thrown up is again, this difference between the systemic suppliers, which are generally the tech suppliers, generally people like the cloud providers, that have now become so ingrained in our financial system that they are systemic and would but they are not regulated financially. And there's been lots of debate about whether they should come under direct supervision or indirect supervision. There's a huge concentration risk, as been done, and that individual firms cannot tackle that themselves. It has to be done across the sector. So it feels, from a UK perspective, that DORA is starting to think about how that would happen, and actually bring some of these firms into supervision and oversight. The payment system providers might be something that I think has been raised, some feedback on DORA, but whether they should be in. But there feels like there could be real benefit. But again, we come back to that proportionality and perhaps sort of the tiering and how level 2 might differentiate, because there's a very different requirement to do that as a sector as to do it as individual firms with your own supply chain or much smaller providers. And where the benefit comes, does it come from those, or does it come from the bigger systemic sort of bringing those into some level of oversight? So that type of thing, that's where DORA is really pushing the boundary, I think, compared to others. And if they get it right, then I think there's real benefit. Within the UK, there are collaboration groups that sort of sit underneath and support the regulators, and those are cross-sector, industry-led collaboration groups, and they are looking at several different areas. One is setting some standards for third parties and outsourcing to support the new regulation. So that's the industry coming together to try and set those standards. And again, that includes ICT and others, because again, there's a need of things, but DORA might actually be a model that, as I say, if we get it right, sort of the blueprint, if you like, for how to deal with that third party piece. So I'm not quite answered your question, but it just off the back of what William said, I think that's, again, it sort of comes back to where would we see the benefit as a sector? What the outcome driven will help us, I think, to make sure we get that right.
Thank you, Stella. So, Tomasz, I'd like to turn to you now. You've heard from the industry of the importance of really getting this oversight framework right. Maybe I'd like to ask for your thoughts on what you've heard, whether you think the scope is right, the oversight regime as it's drafted now. What are your thoughts?
Okay, there are many questions, so I would like to react to some of them. For example, the definition itself, the definition of ICT third-party service provider, definitely we see the same, let's say, challenge, so that the definition is quite broad. It is not quite clear. For example, if ready-made ICT solutions are covered, for example, the supplies of, I don't know, antivirus software, and so on and so forth. It seems that it was not the intention, but the definition is not quite clear about that. The same is for example, the provision of data. Again, is it really the ICT service or not? So definitely here we have questions, and we think that the definition should be quite clear on the level 1. We should avoid, let's say, some later necessary interpretative solution. So definitely that the further work should be done in this field. Then again, there was the mentioning of the supervision and potential problems rising from the fact that some ICT providers definitely will provide services even to entities that are not in the financial sector. So again, there is a question how we should or we could avoid, let's say, the requirements from the, let's say, financial sector and the requirements from the rest. For example, requirements that will be performed by the NIS authorities, like the authorities responsible for the whole ICT security of the system. So it is really the question, who should oversight or supervise such ICT service providers? Is it really necessary to have the supervision in the financial, let's say, market, the financial supervision, and some additional supervision for the rest of the sector? Isn't it better to have just one, let's say, overseer for the whole sector of services that are serviced by these particle ICT service provider. So again, I think some further discussion, some further work should be done to be quite sure that we are quite consistent across the sectors, because it was mentioned several times that these entities are not operating just for financial market.
Thank you, Thomas. Jan, if I may turn back to you, maybe you could give us your thoughts about the design of the oversight framework as to whether, what would be the appropriate level of supervision. Should the responsibilities be with the ESAs or with the national competent authorities?
I think a lot of the points have been picked up here by William and so on already, but I would add that really to avoid some of the fragmentation, look, we support the Commission's proposal here. I think the core powers need to remain with a lead overseer, and I think the NCAs should ideally only be able to take action vis-a-vis the providers in scope, in coordination with the lead overseer. I think where the potential challenge really comes in is where you've got the sharing of regulatory responsibility across the three ESAs, and potentially choosing different lead overseers based on the customers an entity is serving. So I think tend to support any proposals more where there's an overseer with expertise and the ability to conduct that business, I think, across the union in a consistent manner, and where there aren't divergences for different types of operators.
Thomas, so if I may go back to you, there was also a question in the chat about oversight and whether national financial authorities are equipped to do proper oversight of digital services, cyber risks. Should this be left to the European supervisory authorities? Maybe I want to dig a bit deeper on what are your thoughts on that?
We think that really what is the crucial is the fact of cooperation. So we are, for example, currently working on some draft suggestions so that the current, let's say, a set of rules that are implemented under the NIS 1 directive, when we have some national CSIRT teams that are able to provide some guidance, and even they are able to provide, let's say, some kind of oversight over ICT management framework. We think that this knowledge that is really, let's say, done in practice should be kept, so that national financial competent authorities could collaborate it with those national CSIRT teams. So this could be, in my point of view, the way how we should or we could ensure so that the knowledge is shared between several public authorities, and that could be the way forward how the, let's say, financial supervision could be helped, guided by CSIRT teams under NIS directives.
Thank you, Thomas. As we're nearing the wrap-up of the discussion, I like to do another kind of tour de table of all the speakers. And, we discussed a lot of different issues in the past hour. Maybe as kind of your last interventions, what, or if any, parts of the proposal do you think are the most critical or potentially the most need of any amendments, or not? And how do we ensure that this legislative framework is really future-proof and it does not harm innovation in Europe, as we discussed in this conversation? So maybe I'll start with you, Stella.
I think in terms of my own personal interest as well in sort of what DORA covers and the work that I do with financial firms, if I leave to side one moment the sort of third party piece, the testing elements and I probably don't know DORA's inside out as some of you probably, but but having a risk-based approach to testing and actually doing as realistic, rigorous testing as possible, and actually historically, certainly in certain pockets, the testing hasn't been that way. We overly plan certain testing, and it's not realistic, and we then make huge assumption and build our view of our operational resilience capability actually on a large amount of assumption, and then in reality, when we have an issue and a disruption, technology disruption, we uncover that assumption that things didn't work as they should. So I have a real personal interest in the testing element and being able to drive out, again, risk-based I think is the right way to do it and things, but again, sort of how that, again, the testing elements, how that links with the other legislations and regulatory requirements, and again, so we're not forcing firms to do multiple different things just to answer regulatory questions, but doing the right testing for the right outcomes, because that's where I think we as a sector really need to focus on proving some of these things and making sure that we can actually take confidence. So that was just as a sort of personal thing. The testing element for me will be key as well going forward for DORA and other regulations as well.
Thank you, Stella. I saw, William, you were nodding your head, you were agreeing, so I'll give you the next word.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, clearly the testing piece is interesting, but I think in terms of the overall approach, one of the really important things here to recognize is, whether we're talking about it from an industry perspective, whether we're talking about it from a regulatory perspective, or for the perspective of the third parties, is to recognize that we all have the same objective, right? We all have the objective to preserve the ability for the entire sector to be able to anticipate and respond to and recover from extreme events, right? And I think if we start from that foundation, that creates the opportunity for strong partnership between all aspects of it. Again, industry, regulatory, and the providers. It promotes an environment where we can start to think about alignment. And actually that's, as Stella was talking about testing, right? One of the opportunities here is to look at the threat-led penetration testing regime and introduce more opportunities for mutual recognition and alignment there, and to remain really focused on the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve. I think, we have, as the industry, we have a front row seat to a lot of the big disruptions that are happening from a cyber perspective, and the opportunity to continue to work with the commission and the regulators and the supervisors, sharing the expertise and the experience that we have and building a strong foundation together to address that, I think is one of the key messages I would like to deliver today.
Claudia, if I can pass to you now, maybe you can react to things you've heard during the discussion.
Yes, many things that were discussed, and I think it was very interesting discussion. And it's fair to say that to promote innovation, the DORA proposal is part of the digital finance package. So there is much more. I think that this will be discussed also in other panels between today and tomorrow. And I think it's a good point that has already been made during the discussion is that we always need to be sure that for the same activity, same risk, we have the same regulation and the same supervision. In this case, I want to say that if we want to promote innovation, we need to be sure that also the risks are addressed. And they're addressed again in a consistent, harmonized way. So there may be amendments to be done to the proposal for sure, but I think that the approach, the idea, the objective of increasing consistency, harmonization, terminology of policies and of reporting is a very good one.
Thank you, Claudia. Jan, if I may pass over to you now.
Yeah, I think, as I said before, international openness is key, both in ensuring that the EU remains the most attractive and successful single market, and it continues to foster innovation and really deliver on the promises also of the digital agenda of building up the next type of generation of leading companies. And I think that goes hand in hand really with minimizing onerousness. ensuring that the obligations are proportionate to the risk being addressed here. And in many of I think the technical aspects of DORA, that's done very well. We and the industry may make certain suggestions, perhaps, on some of the details. But perhaps when it comes to the oversight framework for CTPPs, having a little more detail and perhaps further refining some of those the work there, I think can really take DORA forward and ensure that it is going to remain relevant for time to come.
Thank you, Jan. And then last but not least, Thomas.
Yeah, so to add to what was already has been said, I think the concept of clarity, it's something I would like to see in the final DORA regulation itself, because otherwise it will be quite difficult to implement the regulation. We could see, for example, in the licensing procedure, some prolonged times. It would harm new entrants to join the market. So the clarity of the draft and of the final package is something that I would like to see to help financial market and to avoid some further additional, let's say, explanatory measures that should be avoided.
Thank you. So, and with this, I'm going to go towards closing our panel. I would like to thank you to all my panelists. I think we managed in this 1 hour and a bit to cover a very broad range of topics and really go into depth into some of them. So thank you really very, very much for that and for joining us today.